All right. Good morning, everybody. I see we've got the front row attendees in the house already. Boston, Austin, Maryland. Welcome, everyone. My name is Gene Stakov. I will be your moderator for this session. Let me just get rid of this banner. There we go. So we're going to start momentarily. This is the Ethics, Data Science, and Artificial Intelligence session at Confirm 2021 with your speaker, Sharon Morris. I'm going to introduce Sharon in just a minute. Before I do that, I just want to say a couple of words about our sponsor. This session is being sponsored by our friends at Collabware. And Collabware, for those who don't know, they create intelligent ECM software for SharePoint and Microsoft 365 that improves information management and records management. And it enhances the way people communicate, collaborate, and consume information. Collabware is available on-prem or cloud, and it ensures regulatory and legal compliance by increasing team productivity, protecting sensitive data, and just helping organizations quickly locate the information that they need to make better decisions. So we say thank you to Collabware for sponsoring this session, and we invite our audience to reach out to them directly via the link on this session or in our sponsors section to learn more. Okay, and that being said, we're ready to start our session now. I will ask that you please save your questions toward the end of the presentation. Sharon's going to have a slide specifically dedicated to questions, and at that point, we'll ask everything that's in the queue. I'll collect what's being asked, and I'll make sure that Sharon gets all the questions. And with that being said, let me introduce Sharon Morris. So this is a great line here. First, let me bring Sharon up on the screen. Hey, Sharon.
Hey, hello. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning. Now, when we say good morning to Sharon, we emphasize morning because she's in Hawaii right now, and it's I don't need to, you guys can do the calculations yourself, but it's pretty early in Hawaii. So whatever jealousy you have when I mention Hawaii, maybe that'll be tempered by the realization that she's up so early to do this, and we very much appreciate it, Sharon. Thank you. So Sharon lives to put the appropriate context to data, which is just an awesome introduction. She started her career as a researcher, and she worked for several nonprofit organizations where she co-authored some research studies, and then worked with some pretty big financial services companies, including a little company called Chase, Federal Home Loan Bank of New York, Fannie Mae. In all these places, she used her analytics and research skills to monitor the voice of the customer and to develop in-house statistical sampling methods. She went on to hold several IG and data governance roles while always using her data analytics skills. And in 2014, while working for PricewaterhouseCoopers, she refocused on her career in data science. Sharon's currently a manager in the data science and AI organization at Prudential and an adjunct associate for the Master of Science Data Analytics program at Columbia University. I don't know how you find the time to do all this, Sharon, and still do presentations with us, but we thank you. I'm going to turn it over to you now. We're in for a real treat. I sat in on one of these sessions last year at Confirm that Sharon did, and it was a hit. I learned so much, and very much looking forward to it. And I'm sure I speak for the audience as well. So Sharon, over to you.
Hey, good morning, everyone in the virtual world. This is quite interesting. I can't see anyone, so hopefully I don't do any make any kind of weird movements. Thank you for attending this session. This is a very important topic because as AI becomes more pervasive in everyday life, we really have to think about what are the implications and what are the ethical issues. And since it's not new, but it's relatively new in the sense that we recently had the computing power to really execute these. And so there's a lot of the good thing is there are a lot of conversations about the ethical issues and what needs to be done. So today, we will look at some of the ethical concerns and how machine learning and AI, I will sometimes use machine learning and AI interchangeably, but they are and they're not, but later we'll talk about that, the history of AI bias, and any initiative to address any AI ethical concerns that are out there. So let's start. What are some of the concerns? I mean, this list is not exhaustive. There are other concerns. One of the major concerns, and I think for me, that's one of my pet peeves, is lack of transparency. And what do I mean by lack of transparency? There are 2 degrees of transparency here. One with respect to, if you think about an organization that uses AI, say to get to service their customers. I mean, some of them, AI is their secret sauce. So as such, no one, they're going to keep that on that's intellectual property. So no one really knows what they're using, like your bank or whomever, how they're using AI or what they're using AI for. And then there's the second degree of transparency is that some of the AI models are so complex because the whole concept of AI is really about it learning, and some AI models can create other AI models. So the complexity of the model increased greatly. So if you ask the engineers who created a model, sometimes they can't really tell you how it was created or a methodical way of how it's created. And that's problematic because, as you understand, lack of transparency prohibits true governance and accountability. And governance is something we all know about. Then there's bias and discrimination. This one always seemed to catch everyone a little like, what do you mean by bias and discrimination? Because it's under the notion that AI is more subjective than human beings. And so how could it possibly? But think about it. What is the engine that feeds AI? It's data. And if you think about data are always collected in a context and reflect the cultural and social issues within our society, right? For instance, what do I mean by that? For instance, there was in 2015, I believe, Amazon decided to use AI to help with their recruiting process. And as such, they use data from the candidates who have applied in the past. And the list of candidates, that data were mainly males and white males. So what ended up happening, that data were fed into the AI recruiting model for Amazon. And what do you think happened? How an AI model is built, it only understands what it sees. So what ended up happening, the women or anyone else wasn't being interviewed because the model were just choosing men. So that's how a model becomes biased and how it can lead to discrimination, because there's no rules in building the AI model itself that address bias and discrimination. I did touch a little bit on lack of governance and accountability because let's think about this for instance, let's say a self-driving car, unfortunately, let's say a self-driving car ends up killing a pedestrian. Who's accountable? Is it the engineers who created the model? Is it the car manufacturer? Who is accountable? So those are some of the complexities with respect to governance and accountability. And homogeneous teams. I mean, this is something that's really pervasive in the AI space. And it creates bias in itself. And the reason, and these are unintentional biases, it's not deliberate in most instances. I mean, one benign case is where the soap dispensers that we all use, you put your hand on and it dispenses soap. Some of the engineers who created one of the AI model for a soap dispenser, they were predominantly white males. And what ended up happening, if I put my hands under the dispenser, it would not dispense soap. So, and think about if teams are more diverse, everyone brings different perspectives, and that will really help reduce some of the biases that are interjected into AI models. And then there's democracy and civil rights. And I know there's been a lot going on lately. AI is with disinformation, reducing civil rights, and so those are some of the major concerns with respect to ethical AI. So next, let's look about what machine learning can do, just to help us understand how it's in every aspect of our life. Let's say you input a picture. I'm sure we all remember back in the day when Facebook would ask us to tag. We were all training their machine learning algorithm to identify who we are. So input is a picture, and then the AI model algorithm is created to say every time it sees the pictures, is it a human? Is it not a human? And that's when, and the application is tagging photos. This is Sharon in the photo. There's Jean in the photo. In loan applications, when you submit a loan application, some AI models are determining whether you repay the loan or not. It's either it's 0 or 1, you will or will not. And that's how loans are approved. Ad plus user input. When you click on an ad, the AI model is like, will you click or not? And that's how you get targeted advertising. Audio clips. The input is audio clips. It transcribes audio clips, and that's with speech recognition. Input an English language. That's how Google Translate works. You get a French sentence, and that's language translation. As you can see, it seems like AI is in every aspect of our lives. This is like such a small list, but as you can see, it's kind of touching every place in our life. And this is why it's so important for us to really start thinking about what does this mean for society and how do we put some ethics around this. Okay, my computer doesn't. So AI is not all bad. There's some really great thing about AI, and it used properly. And I know there are a lot of people who are working academics, and a lot of nonprofits are working about using data for good, to improve how city works and all of these things. You know, AI can really help people live longer and fulfilling lives. There's AI who's helping the elderly who have their physical capacity is being diminished. AI helps with that. It's transforming most professions. I know sometimes when we think about AI transforming professions, we conjure up, oh my God, the computers are going to take over and we're all not going to have jobs. But it's really not to that capacity. Some of that will happen, but it's really in the capacity, like if AI is focused, for instance, you're an attorney, AI, and you have like a slew of paperwork to go through, AI can really kind of like identify and highlight what are the salient pieces of paper, and then the attorney can use their time in the different ways. And there's opportunities for economic development. A study by PwC showed by AI would improve global GDP by 14% by 2030. So there are a lot of good things that can come out of AI as well. I've been mentioning this AI thing. What exactly is it? Artificial intelligence refers to a system that displays intelligent behavior by analyzing the environment and taking action with some degree of autonomy. But for some people and the purists, it's like AI using artificial intelligence is a misnomer, just because it's like, is AI really intelligent? Human intelligence, that's real intelligence. We can discern different things. We can kind of like have one belief system, and after being introduced to different types of information, we change that, right? AI doesn't have that capacity because AI is essentially, for some of the purists, it's just pattern recognition because it does not have that intelligence. So what I mean by that is like, for instance, in a self-driving car is trained. This is the road. This is what the road looks like. There's a line on the road. You drive on this side of the road. These are the signs. But let's say, for instance, it snowed that day and the lines on the road are covered. Then, you know, AI doesn't know what to do. But a human would know that the line exists. However, it's just covered with snow. Let's look at this. This is about the history of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is the broader scope of it all, and it's really about mathematical models. And the term artificial intelligence was coined in the 1950s. So none of this is new. What ends up happening is like we didn't have the computing power, and since AI is so data hungry, so to speak, the data didn't exist nor the computing power. So at the time when it was coined, it was just a mathematical models. Then machine learning is a subset of AI, and that's when the computing powers start to come into play around the 1980s. And then there's a concept of deep learning. Deep learning is what built on neural networks. Some people like to say it mimics how the human brain works, but some people think that's crazy. There's always a lot of views and everything. So deep learning is what like self-driving cars are built upon, and that's happened more in the 2000s. And again, this is all being driven by the improvement in computing power. So why do we need data and AI ethics? I know I've been talking a lot about AI ethics. We also need data ethics because coming from a data governance perspective or information of a data governance perspective, the true governance, there are two layers. The governance start with the data. And what I mean by that is like, just like in IG, when the data are collected in the data governance perspective, if the quality of the data are there, meaning what I mean by that, if we understand what are the missing values, if the data are biased, let's say there are more males in the data than females or females than male, if all those things are understood, when the data are chosen to be used in an AI model, we can really adjust for that as we're building the model. So data ethics, and the data ethics also drive to making sure it's in alignment with GDPR and other privacy rules and CCPA and all of those rules. And that's where the governance piece comes into place, and understanding the context and lineage. One of the main reasons why so many times that models are built and the interpretations are incorrect because the context is missing. For instance, there are models that are built that are mathematically sound. However, because of the contextual time period in society when the data were collected, that's where the gap is. If there are no subject matter experts there, then they really can't help with respect to help the engineers understand what are the limitations of the data. One of the big ones that happened with respect to data ethics, there was, I believe, several counties in Florida was using an AI model to determine sentencing, determine sentences based on the likelihood of the accuser to reoffend. What ended up happening, the data they used historical data we had about sentencing in the United States. However, what was missing there from the engineers didn't quite understand it. They probably need someone in the like a sociologist or something like that to help them, or criminologist to help them understand, is like historically in the United States, people of color got harsher sentences for like minor crimes. So what ended up happening every time when it came to sentencing and the profile for the defendants were entered into the model all automatically gave harsher sentences to people of color. And that was just a blind spot there. The data, the ethical issues around the data wasn't there, and thus the model can only create what it's built upon. And then there's AI ethics again. And then the ethics of AI itself is how, when we're building the model and how we're using AI. So those are the two layers of ethics that must happen. So let's look about what is there. There are two things. There's the ethics of AI and there's ethical AI. The ethics of AI is really about the frameworks around and the principles around how AI interacts with AI interacts with human, and how AI interacts with society. And based on those frameworks, as those frameworks are built, that's why the European Union and all of these other places are creating frameworks. Even the United States as a whole, and Congress and several states are really looking at what are the frameworks, because those frameworks break down into really the basics of how AI interacts with other AIs ethically, how AI interacts with humans ethically, and how AI interacts with society ethically. Man, ethically is killing me today. So let's look at some of the overall. This may look familiar to everyone because it's a colorful thing, and it looks like the IG life cycle, because it's all about when you acquire the data, putting the rules around it, but there's some other aspects of it. The acquisition of the data, like when the data are ingested, we need to understand, as I mentioned, in data governance, you need to know the provenance, the lineage, everything that's happened to that data from the time it was born. You need to understand that social context in the acquisition piece in the data. And how the data is stored. Is the data stored in a trusted location? Does it have all of the privacy rules and all the regulatory requirements, the business requirements attached to that data at the time? So it's making sure that it's used appropriately. GDPR really tried to get at this, and there was some fear around how GDPR would impact the whole data science organization, because the whole concept of GDPR is like, you really have to anonymize the data. You can't use data that without allowing the data, without allowing the person whose data you're using, without allowing them to know. And also it was really about reducing, like, certain values in the data cannot be used. And the whole intent was really to reduce bias and discrimination. Like some of the demographic data, data points, they didn't want to be used in GDPR. However, I mean, there's ways around everything, because there's a concept that's called multicollinearity and statistics. And what multicollinearity means, like, for instance, if I remove, like, let's say your race and gender and your income from a model, and I have your zip code, the zip code tells me a lot about you, some of those same components. So it's like, so that's some of the things that GDPR was addressed in. And then there's data manipulation, how we aggregate the data. If the data isn't understood and it's not really balanced, because in most data science, most modeling processes, you're aggregating a lot of data sets and bring them together to make a larger data set in order to feed that model. And then how you analyze and transform the data. This is the point at analyze and transform. This is the second point where bias is introduced into a model. This part of modeling is really an art more than a science. I mean, that might be shocking, but it is actually an art more than a science. What I mean by that is at that point, it's called feature selection. What feature selection is, let's say, for instance, we want to, an organization said, hey, we want to make sure we have more qualified applicants for this loan. What ends up happening is that the engineer is really looking at all the values that would say, will a loan approve, yes or no? They'll put in gender, let's say they put in gender, income, and a host of other, those are the features that determine whether this person is worthy of getting the loan or not. And what ends up happening in the modeling process is it's like a puzzle. You put one value in, let's say you put income in and see how the model improves. Then you put zip code in, you see how the model improves. So it's a lot of subjectivity in that part of the modeling process. And as I already mentioned, the process itself doesn't have any guards around biases. And then there's use of the data. How is the data used for insights? If all of the processes that preceded use are incorrect and wasn't done properly, then the use of that data and the insights that are gleaned from that data obviously is misinterpreted, or they sell and use the data. And we all know at the end, you dispose the data from our servers for future use if we don't want it to be there. So as you see, the importance is all about the data ethics upfront, then in the process itself. And I just wanted to show AI ethics again, start with data. I really wanted to stress this point. The ethics, it really start with data. Because if the data, as I mentioned several times, is protected, if balanced stewardship, if you have the provenance, the accuracy, the security, which is and all around the rules around data privacy, the fairness, the governance, the transparency, then the AI that's created using that data can only be human-centric and reduce bias and discrimination. It's auditable, there's transparency, there's statistical accuracy, and there's robustness. So how does bias happen in AI? I alluded to this earlier in the process itself. So this is a higher level process of how you will build a model, an AI model. You start, a business has a problem. The business calls you and the marketing department calls you and they say, hey, we want to make sure this quarter we have 40% increase in our approval levels. That's what the marketing department is telling the data science team. Now the data science team's responsibility is to interpret that into a machine learning model, like into a data science machine learning problem. And that interpretation is where sometimes we can have some issues. For instance, again, now let's say since the marketing department wanted to increase approvals by 40% of loans, then let's say the data scientists interpret that, well, we're only going to look at this zip code, for instance, because this zip code, people have a higher income and they're more likely to repay the loans. Then what has it done? That model automatically is biased. It excludes everyone else who doesn't fit the profile of this specific zip code. So that's where it could be introduced. And that's a human bias. That's part of our cognitive biases. And then it's collecting the data. Is the data representative? Because of how our society has functioned and how it's evolving, is the data representative? I know we've all heard that there's zettabytes of data and most of the data have been created in the last couple of years. Yes, that's true. We have tons of data. The question becomes, is it the right data? We're using data from the past to predict the present when the past may not necessarily look like the present. And that's a problem. And that's why it's important to govern the data, because if the data are governed appropriately and all of these things are accounted for with the appropriate SMEs involved in the process, this is something the modeler would know about the data. And in that sense, they could create simulated data if needed to make up for the biases in the data. Let me give you an example. For instance, back in the day, I mean, mainly a lot of women were stay-at-home moms, housewives. So men were the ones who were applying for loans. They had income and all of those things. That data, if you're using data about loan prediction for loans approval going forward in our current state, then you would only choose men to approve men for those loans because that's what society reflects. But if the data scientist knows that, then they can create some simulated data to balance the data set so it wouldn't be 80% men and 20% women, and make it a little bit more balanced. And that would reduce some of the biases. And I alluded to this again, preparing the data with respect to the features and understanding what goes in and what features to be used. Because a lot of times, a lot of data scientists, in addition to using some of the techniques that allow you to like backward and stepwise regression to allow you to introduce some of the features that will give you the outcome, they are just eyeballing it sometimes, and they're like, yeah, based on my experience, I know this, like income, for instance, would allow for a greater approval of a loan. And that's where it becomes, that's the preparation. And that's the preparation of the data. And when they train the data, because during the process, we train the data as building the model before it's released. And that's where some biases can also be introduced. And then what is AI bias? Bias is an anomaly in the output of a machine learning algorithm. These could be due to prejudice assumptions made by the algorithm development process, or prejudices in the training data. So there are two, the human biases, and then there's also the data and statistical biases that are involved in this process. And the types of biases, the cognitive bias, the designer unknowingly introduced bias. And a lot of these times when these biases are introduced, it's just unknown, and it's a conscious bias. It's not something people are willingly doing. And then the statistical bias is really about unrepresented data. Potential ways to reduce bias. I thought this was great. This is put together by McKinsey. One of the ways is really to be aware of the context in which AI can help correct for biases, and those in which it can introduce high risk. And this is something in IG we always talk about, right? Our information and our records are created in the context of a business process. And that's why the whole concept about usability, right? If you're not aware of the context, how can you use that data or that information? And then establish processes and practices to test and mitigate bias in AI systems. This is where we have a huge blind spot. The process itself, there are nothing in there for biases. So organizations right now and some of these frameworks are coming up with, how do we address that? And engage in fact-based conversations around potential human bias and decision. We're human beings, we have bias. It's not like we're bad people, we just do. And explore how humans and machines can work best. And 5 is really calling for a real call to action to invest in more bias research to see how we can really reduce it, and invest more in diversifying the AI field itself. Why is AI bias difficult to fix? I've said it a million times during this. And the introduction of bias isn't always obvious, and standard modeling practices are not designed to detect biases. The lack of social context in data collection, and unclear definitions of fairness. I mean, how do you, for a model to be fair and unbiased, what is fairness? I mean, fairness, the definition of fairness can vary by person, and there's no framework or no overall policy or anything that says this is how we're going to define fairness. So these are some of the complexities involved. And what are the consequences of bias AI? There's discrimination, there's faulty predictions. I remember at Columbia, I was working with a statistician who a PhD in statistics advisor, and we was telling the story about how he built this awesome model. Because building models are so seductive, they're beautiful, and you get caught up in the beauty of just doing them. And he was like, oh my God. Then he showed it to a subject matter expert. They're like, all your predictions are wrong. All your conclusions are wrong. Because again, he didn't understand the context of the data. And faulty predictions leads to faulty conclusions. Where do we go from here? Governments have created regulation, privacy standards, and ethic frameworks. The EU has so many they've created, and there are also a lot of nonprofits in the US that are created. Some states in the US have signed some regulation. Even New York has. De Blasio signed it. I don't know if it's ever been used. And they're in industry-specific standards and frameworks that are being developed for each industry. And then these are some of the global initiatives. The Responsible Computer Science Challenge. That's really about people who are, this is about change training in the education space, about biases and helping them understand how the responsibility when building models and being involved in this process, what are the responsibilities of the engineers? There's the Institute of Ethical AI and Machine Learning, the Beacon Klein Center, the European AI Alliance, and the Open Robo Institute. These are some of the initiatives, the organizations that have initiatives out there to really help reduce this. Because as I said, I mean, the great thing is there's so many conversations around this. And I personally, like I do go to a lot of data science, even be it at Columbia University Data Science Institute or other things. And this is something I push in every conversation I have, because this is where I think this is where my sweet spot is. It's really about what are the ethics. I remember when I was going through my graduate program in data science, there wasn't an ethics course, and I went and spoke to the dean, and I'm like, listen, this is imperative that we have an ethics course. We're empowering people we're giving people a lot of power, and they need to understand what that power means. And so now a lot of the graduate programs have an ethics course involved in this whole process, because it's important that people who are building these models do understand, at least to ask the questions. They don't need to be an expert in the space, but they need to ask these questions of the organizations that they're working with, and then keep an eye out as they're building these models. And any questions? That's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. I think Jean is gonna read the questions, if there are any.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, great stuff, Sharon. Thank you very much. Really underscores the importance of having variance and a diversity of data input, and how that results in just in better, not only a more reflective model, but just a better product. Like the soap dispenser example is, it's terrifying, frankly. It's just a bad product if you have that kind of situation. So
yeah. And it's not intentional. That's the thing. It's not intentional at all, right?
Nevertheless, I mean, it results in a deeply flawed product. That's a product that just doesn't work. If it can only recognize certain types of hands, that's ridiculous. Okay, we do have a couple of questions, and I'm happy to transmit those. So, Leanne,
should I stop sharing?
Sorry?
Should I stop sharing? How does that work? Or
no, you can keep this up. You can keep the screen up. We'll just proceed as we are. So the question is, how are models tested before implementation? And goes on to say, bias is a common human problem. What questions are asked of the data before the model is created? And can biases be detected in the moment during development?
What was the first part? How is models?
How are models tested before implementation? Yeah, there's a couple of things.
Okay. How are models tested before implementation? Models are tested. They're created like, let's say, like when you do like a software development lifecycle before they're put in production. They are created in a QA environment, and then they're tested. But when they're tested for the accuracy level of the model. They're not tested for bias per se, because when you train a model, let's say, for instance, in the loan approval example that I've used earlier, it's like we train to see, let's say it's determined that this model needs to be accurate up to 75% of 100 times. So if that's a threshold we're working with, we're just looking to see if the model is accurate at the 75% threshold. And that's how it happens. So it's really not looking for bias. It's looking for the accuracy of that model itself. And what was the second part? I'm sorry.
The second part was, what questions are asked of the data model before it's created, and can biases be detected in the moment during development?
No, I mean, you know what? That's a really good question. Can biases be detected in the moment? It can be, but it only can be if there's a subject matter expert in the room that understands the context of how the data and the social context or the business context of how the data are created. It can be detected, because then what ends up happening as the model, because as part of the modeling process, after the features are selected, the data are split. Let's say you have 2 million rows of data. The data are split into 80-20, and 80% around 80-20, 70-30, typically around 80-20, 80. So you're training the data 80%, you're training a model on 80% of the data, right? That's when you're playing with the data and the model and putting in features and see how it is and how it goes. And then it's kind of like, then you use that on the other set of the test data. So unless there's a SME in there when you train the data and see what the results are and understand it, then that's the only way. That's one of the ways. I wouldn't say that's the only way that it could be introduced, but typically that's not what's happening.
Great question and great answer. Thank you. There's another one here. Ruth mentioned in the news, there's apparently software available now for making old photos appear alive. I haven't heard of this, but I'm not surprised.
Oh.
What issues do you see coming along with this type of with this type of technology and this type of idea?
Well, that would be something I could akin that to like deep fakes or something.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's like really dangerous because it's like you can really, like, for instance, I don't know if everyone has seen, like, someone could just have an image of me and my mouth is moving and like I'm saying words that I didn't really say. Someone can really distort all my sense. Think about the reputational damage that could be done. I can see this being used in a way as well. Because if they're moving them and make them alive, you can have a video and sharing and saying all these horrible things that never really came out of my mouth. And people, a propensity of that is people to believe that, right? Because it just happens. And it seems like there's so much out there that people, it's easy to move people in one direction or another. And I think that's like seriously dangerous, could be dangerous to reputation of organizations and individuals. I think it's something, and I don't know if it's something, I can't say it's something that can be controlled. It really, how do you control something like that, right?
Yep.
I have no idea how you would even control that.
Agreed. It's going to have to develop.
Yes.
Chris Bednar commented, it's very important for us in information governance not to just know how to manage information, but to know how it's created. Aside from understanding, what can we do in our roles to improve the data?
I think what we bring to our roles is like really the governance piece, because we're usually expert in the privacy and all the regulations, and those still need to, and GDPR and all these things, and these still need to be applied to the data itself, right? Because information is an output of data, right? To the individual data points. And the good thing is, like, something about GDPR, it kind of like hones in on data points themselves and how they should be treated and used, or if they can be used. And that's what ends up evolving into data. And I think as IG professionals, I think it would really help if we can kind of be involved in that discussion too, about, because we're familiar with all the provenance of the data, and like more about the lineage of the data becomes important. And I think we need to also keep that in mind and be part of the conversation, because sometimes when our information is created, where we're in the information side of it, and when we see there may be flaws in the information that we're dealing with, then that we can really feed back to, I don't know, like in my organization, for instance, the data governance people and information governance people are two separate organizations. And if you see that should be a two-way conversation, a feedback loop sometimes, for that to happen, for them to understand these are flaws in the data. Because there are times when, for instance, like our marketing department wanted to reach customers, and there's like there's so much missing data, and we're unable to do all of these things. And I think since you're seeing the information, they could be a feedback loop to help improve both sides.
Yeah, it reminds me of that old ad council tagline: "Knowing is half the battle." Right? Knowing is the first step. Understanding that it's out there. Okay, thank you for that. Steve Weissman asked, "What I know you mentioned a couple of other initiatives that are happening, but Steve asked, what are some good resources for us to access to dig deeper without having our heads explode?" You asked for too much, Steve.
I try, like I had to limit myself because I can find myself getting deeply into the modeling process because it's so exciting. So I mean, you know what? When I've just Googled like AI ethics, there's a lot that came up. There's a lot that came about the European Union, and because there's all over the place, there's like the AI Justice Institute that has a lot of good articles. This one is going out of my head right now. New York University has a organization too. I can't remember the name. And if you can also look like Columbia University has a data science institute, and they usually have like a lot of seminars and webinars and events. The last one I went to, like Eric Schmidt, the former, I think he was a CEO or whatever he was of Google, was there with a conversation with them. And if you look also, as I said, the EU is where I've seen the most. I mean, like all of these frameworks, and Congress, I think in 2019 also signed something. So you can kind of try to start with some of those organizations. There are a lot of nonprofits around there, and a lot of the universities too, outside of Columbia and NYU, are doing things around the ethics. And there's a lot of philosophical conversations you will also find, because, for instance, like the whole notion of self-driving cars, there's the whole philosophical stuff about the ethics of that with respect to, like, when you're in a self-driving car, like right now, if I go into a car, the car doesn't know who I am. And if I have an accident, it's truly a random occurrence. When you go into a self-driving car, potentially they know your male, they know your race, your age. And the question becomes, these are some of the conversations they're having in these forums. It's like, who does the car kill if in an event it has to kill somebody?
Yeah.
Yeah,
no, absolutely. It is very, very deeply philosophical, and these are important questions, and we need to be involved as information governance professionals in that dialogue. You mentioned NYU, and that's a good segue for me to ask ask Jenny Dubin-Rodin's question. That's her alma mater, as it is mine. She asked, would it be wise to hire, say, sociologists when you're putting these sorts of projects together?
Yeah, I think, definitely. I think, and that's what like New York City, the initiative that they signed into law was around, really making sure if you're using data that could potentially, the citizens of New York, if you're using data that includes race or things like that, based on the historical context, we need to have like a sociologist. If you're doing real estate data, real estate experts, you definitely need them involved in the process. But what ends up happening, it doesn't, because I think it becomes like an ego tussle at sometimes, because the data scientists are like, we're in a high ivory tower. We just know this stuff. We don't need anyone else to tell us. And they don't understand the data.
Thank you. I'm going to skip down a couple. We have probably time for another question, maybe two. David Honeman asked, do you modularize a section for biases where you have variables that you can adjust? Or I guess, what is the mechanism where you make these adjustments?
Well, the modelize the bias, do you mean in the process? If it's within the modeling process itself, I think what a SME would help, because what ends up happening, let's say I'm a data scientist and I'm working, and depend on what the business question is, I'm really just making individual decisions to add a variable or not add a variable into the model that can introduce bias. And there's nowhere to modularize that. I think what ends up happening, if we do have the subject matter expert, that would really help in the process. Because I know, I mean, like we were just teaching our students like a couple of weeks ago, and we always telling them, like, this is an art, not a science. And it will be really difficult to modularize the variables as it goes in. Or if we can't, that would be really difficult to do. I don't know how that will work.
Yeah. Well, great question. Excellent answer. Thank you, Sharon. And thank you. This concludes our session. We're just about a minute away from 10:45. Thank you so much for sharing your deep knowledge and expertise with us here today. We know it's early out there in Hawaii, but you can go for a run or a swim on Waikiki Beach when this is over. So there is that.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. This was a terrific session. We appreciate you spending your morning with us. And thank you again to Collabware, without whose support this session wouldn't have been possible. Please visit them, ask questions, and everybody have a great rest of your day and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks all. Bye.